This video is sponsored by Babbel. Feliz Año Nuevo, mi amo Shania or Shakespeare, y bienvenidos a mi página. Wouldn't it be funny if absolutely everything I just said was incorrect? I think we all need to be a little more realistic with ourselves in the new year. One of my New Year's resolutions was to eat healthy and save money. I made a food mood board and pinned all these financial tips. And then I felt an inkling of sadness this morning and spent $20 on McDonald's. I clearly don't care about my body. I will eat the pink Teletubby slime so long as it's salty and makes me forget that we're hurtling aimlessly on a rock in space. But I do care about my mind. After all, I can't take over the world if I have the IQ of a toupee. And if you're spending your free time watching video essays like this, you clearly care about your mind too. And that's why Babbel is our realistic resolution. I'm still not even fluent in English, and I've been trying this for 22 years. So the fact that Babbel could help me with Spanish this much in just a few short weeks is amazing. I've been using Babbel since the end of November 2021 and miraculously have stayed committed. Clearly more than I stayed committed to having a healthy colon. My fiance is from Mexico and his family speaks Spanish, so for the past 6 years, I really wanted to learn Spanish in order to better bond with them. And I have not been able to do that. I would download all of these different language learning apps, but it felt like I wasn't progressing past the vocabulary stage. I could say yellow and apple all day long, but I still couldn't construct a sentence. That's where Babbel is different. It teaches real-world, practical conversations in your target language that you'll actually use. Not only that, but you can learn about the culture and slang of your target language all in short 10-minute interactive lessons. In my first few weeks of learning Spanish on Babbel, I learned the alphabet, began learning grammar systems and verbs so that I can construct sentences, and learned how to say which languages I speak. You can learn from traditional lessons, short videos, audios, online classes, and even games. If you want to try out Babbel for the new year and flex on monolinguals, follow the link in my description to get 65% off your subscription. Thank you to Babbel for sponsoring this video and for finally giving me the opportunity to better connect with family. Let me know what your New Year's resolutions are in the comments and what languages you want to learn for 2022. As Gregor Samsa awoke one morning from uneasy dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a gigantic insect. He was lying on his hard, as if it were armor-plated back, and when he lifted his head a little, he could see his dome-like brown belly divided into stiff arched segments, on top of which the bedquilt could hardly keep in position and was about to slide off completely. His numerous legs, which were pitifully thin compared to the rest of his bulk, waved helplessly before his eyes. This is the opening paragraph of Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis, first published in 1915. The idea of a man-turned insect came to Kafka as he was lying miserably in bed, unable to make progress on his first novel. Rife with the tragic, nightmarish qualities that feed the term Kafkaesque, The Metamorphosis goes something like this. Gregor Samsa, an ex-military lieutenant and current commercial traveler, has just awoken for the day to find himself miraculously transformed into a giant beetle. This transformation proves troublesome for 3 reasons. First, Gregor finds himself lacking his previous mobility. Second, he finds that he cannot go to work in this condition. And third, everyone is absolutely repulsed by Gregor. This repulsion is not only on the physical basis of his appearance, which is a rather demanding theme of the story, but also, the repulsion stems from Gregor's sudden lack of mobility and, as a result, his inability to participate in capitalism. The family no longer views Gregor as human and decidedly treats him as such. His father throws apples at him, further disabling Gregor. His mother faints or screams whenever he's near, and his sister grows to resent him and the responsibility he represents. In the end, his family, like his job beforehand, turn on him completely and devise a plan to get rid of him. Gregor, overhearing this plan, retires to his bedroom one final time and dies in his sleep. The next morning, upon discovering his body, his family is relieved. They take the day off of work to relax in the city and find their future quite hopeful without the burden of their brother and son. Kafka's Metamorphosis can be interpreted a number of ways. Charles Nider considers the story a result of Kafka's father complex, because clearly I cannot get away from this man to save my life. And Nina Pelikan interprets the story through a feminist lens, declaring that it is Greta who transforms as a daughter, sister, and woman throughout the plot. When I was in college, I argued that the metamorphosis was an allegory for ableism in a capitalist society, as Gregor makes frequent mentions of his loss of mobility and lack of accessibility provided by his family. This could also just be a projection, as the feelings expressed in the metamorphosis somewhat relate to how I feel as someone with both severe GAD and bipolar disorder. I don't feel like a beetle per se, but I do feel very dehumanized at times when I'm unable to do the things other people are able to do, like grocery shopping or even texting. The intertwining of ableism and capitalism is further confirmed by the chief clerk of Gregor's job, who states, quote, "I hope Gregor's illness isn't serious, although on the other hand, I must say that we men of business, fortunately or unfortunately, very often simply have to ignore any slight indisposition, since business must be attended to," end quote. Or the metamorphosis can be a fun story about a boy turned beetle, and everyone who looks farther than that is probably a video essayist on YouTube. This interpretation may be more welcome amongst the group of people who denounce literary analysis in favor of having fun with fictional stories. This sort of belief is best exemplified by Robin N. Hill's blog post titled, "But Why Are the Curtains Blue?" A rant about literary criticism. The infamous blue curtains reference in Robin's title is a meme that portrays a Venn diagram. On the left side of the chart, we have what the author meant when they wrote about the blue curtains in their story. On the right, we have what your English teacher thinks the author meant. The English teacher, drunk with philosophy, argues that the blue curtains represent the character's depression. The author rebuttals with a flat,
"The curtains were just blue."
It's a funny meme that I probably reference in passing conversation, but there are some, like Robin Hill, who take it quite seriously. Hill references this meme as a way to prove that we don't need to look for nuance in the things we read, especially when those things are fictional and subjective. To Hill, the curtains are blue because they happen to be blue, not because of some grand allegory. The beautiful thing about complex subjects and critically engaging with them is realizing that both Robin and the English professor in the scenario can be right. Like Hill, I think fictional reading should be first and foremost fun. Not every story is written with a grand message in mind. Is it not enough to read a story about an undead 108-year-old who attends high school and falls in love with a minor?
Why don't you take the empty seat next to that mysterious boy you're destined to have a fatalistic relationship with that will spawn 4 books and a movie franchise?
Even as an English major who first concentrated in literary studies and then professional writing, I can critically engage with the text of my major and see a majority of it as inaccessible or downright pompous. But on the other hand, I can also appreciate literary analysis, and in that way English studies, as viable hobbies, school subjects, and even jobs, because I think it holds immense cultural value. It's possible to be critical of what you consume and still have fun with what you're doing. I mean, just look at this channel. I am having a blast. Robin is not the only one who feels this way about literary criticism and, by extension, the entirety of the English studies subject. You can find memes about English majors overanalyzing texts, references to evil English professors who waterboard you for incorrectly analyzing something, and numerous, albeit good-natured and very funny videos parodying video essayists. And speaking of video essayists, they tend to receive the brunt of this new wave of ridicule from commenters who claim they're doing too much or overanalyzing their topics. I find it interesting, this degradation of English analysis. It's not horrible or evil or whatever else people think critical analysis implies. It's just interesting. When we degrade the act of critical analysis and call it useless, as Robin does, we're drawing upon rhetoric used for centuries by our predecessors, and in fact, just regurgitating capitalist talking points. This is going to get really pretentious really quickly. I'm going to keep it real with you all. I thought Plato and Aristotle were fictional characters in a story made up by someone who existed before God. Socrates too. I just thought there's no way people would name their child after a consignment store or feet clothes. I mean, Aristotle sounds like a Febreze scent. But they did exist, and they were major influences for the first schools in the West and our modern universities. In the introduction to their book, English Studies, An Introduction to the Disciplines, Bruce McComiskey expands upon the history of the English studies and what brought it to its current devalued position in academia. Although it's arguable that English studies always had to defend itself from detractors, forms of it still had a place in early education. Based on 3rd, 4th, and 5th century BCE Athenian democracies, say that 10 times fast. Medieval era education focused on rhetoric, grammar, logic, arithmetic, astronomy, geometry, and music. Now, if that sounds like some Hogwarts level shit, don't worry. There were far too many people of color who participated in these subjects, rhetoric especially, for it to have anything to do with Harry Potter and the echo chamber of whiteness. Rhetoric became fairly popular because it was of the general belief that being able to articulate and communicate effectively was more important than simply being knowledgeable. McComiskey states that rhetoric, therefore, quote, was the foundation of a liberal education, end quote. I took a rhetoric course in college. It was more or less against my will, but that isn't the point. My textbook for the course, Rhetoric and Human Consciousness by Craig R. Smith, explains that rhetoric is an ancient art, emerging as early as 2100 BC. The Rhetoric Wikipedia states that it emerged in Mesopotamia with Princess and Priestess Enheduanna's writings, and also found a claim in ancient Egypt, China, and Greece. Aristotle, who again is somehow real, considered humans speaking animals and declared that in order for us to make sound decisions, we need rhetoric. To Aristotle, rhetoric could be defined as, quote, the art of discovering in any given case the available means of persuasion, end quote. Rhetoric is the tool politicians use when they give speeches. It's what video essayists use when they try to sway a person's opinion on a subject. It's something that even you, as a viewer, could use when you recommend people your favorite channels. In short, it, quote, operates to influence behavior, change attitudes, and articulate opinions, end quote. Understanding rhetoric and knowing when it's being used as a mask for one's true intentions can allow us to challenge lies or propaganda, especially in whatever hell simulation we've been devolving into. So rhetoric was just one way that early English teachers began defending their usefulness, but they found that over time, it was getting harder and harder to keep their place on the pedestal. It's the 19th century, aka the 1800s, and not much is going on in the boring country of North America. I mean, some dudes fought. This guy went to a play and the person behind him couldn't see over his hat, so they complained to the theater staff, who took the tall hat guy out back, and the complainer heard a gunshot but was told it was unrelated. Oh, and the government realized that we were approaching a crisis. Besides this one, there was a growing demand for food alongside the urbanization of the United States, and the government found that reforming higher education would solve this demand alongside other pressing matters. This resulted in the Morrill Act of 1962, which granted non-Confederate states access to federal lands to establish colleges on. These colleges, the most notable being Cornell University and MIT, were required to offer degrees in agriculture, engineering/applied sciences, and ROTC in order to maintain their grant status. It's also worth noting that these federal lands were taken from indigenous people through wars, cession, and force, as was all the land in the United States. But it's just ironic because the North American government claimed to have just been giving away federal land like they were Oprah, but were really seizing millions of acres from indigenous people in the name of good deeds. As we discussed earlier, education before the first Morrill Act focused on the same subjects: law, medicine, rhetoric, arithmetic, and history. When the Morrill Act passed, however, and the state schools began centering more practical subjects, English studies were set aside as general education requirements and have remained there to this day. Gen Ed courses are those pesky subjects that take up the first 2 years of your college career. They're mainly set to broaden your perspectives according to and Denon, and for that reason, you're not expected to take specialized courses until you're finished with your general education. So these gen ed courses stand as a blockage between eager freshmen and their majors. One of the great things about the Morrill Act was that it made college accessible for the less wealthy, less classically trained, white students. But that accessibility also meant that the numbers of enrollments surged dramatically as more white students were able to enter higher education. English studies, meanwhile, was growing to be a misunderstood and degraded subject. After all, not everyone wanted to be an orator or writer. English professors were already overworked due to high admissions and were reading thousands of papers across the term. On top of that, they were also becoming underappreciated by non-English majors. McComiskey states, required composition was, by the turn of the century, so dreaded that it was relegated almost entirely to the ranks of graduate teaching assistants and part-time non-tenure track instructors. This, quote, created a marginalized workforce that remains in place today, end quote. Not only was English dreaded by both professors and agitated students, but it was constantly compared to the more practical disciplines like science and math by people who were beginning to find English useless as a result. Graham Ho wrote in 1964, "The humanities do not make anything explode or travel faster, and the powers that be at present are not much interested in anything else," end quote. Since it was impossible to measure the success of English studies on students the way one could math or science, English and other humanities like history and art fell on the chopping block. Ben Nelms writes in Toward a New Professionalism, English Education in the mid-1970s that this final nail in the coffin of English studies led to America, quote, teaching for the test rather than for growth, end quote, and, quote, applied an emphasis on actuality rather than possibility, end quote. We can see how the history of English studies and the reasoning people gave for discrediting it informs how we interact with it in a contemporary age. We, too, find it more vague than practical. We, too, think it's a waste of time. And more than ever, we're realizing that uselessness in the education realm translates to uselessness in the job force. And being useless in the job force is the worst thing anyone could be at all. According to Benjamin Schmidt, there was always word of a crisis occurring in the humanities. But after the 2008 recession, the numbers provided by the Department of Education of total enrolled humanities majors began dropping at alarming rates. In fact, the number of English majors alone were cut in half compared to the 1990s. Though people speculated that this decline was due to the prospect of student debt, vanishing jobs, or postmodern relativism, Schmidt argues that by transforming educational systems into job factories, where people go in as students and come out as workers, while simultaneously painting the English studies as useless, we've conditioned younger generations to believe the humanities have no place in the job force. In high school, I was even told that I should rethink my college plans because a job in the humanities wasn't realistic. I was told I would be the smartest, unemployed person in the room. Coincidentally, this was not the same faculty member who told me that I wasn't special when I confided in them about my financial troubles. The American public school system is really great, by the way. Schmidt asserts that these biases of STEM and humanities aren't even true. For instance, biology majors make less than the average graduate, while psychology has one of the lowest median earnings. On the other hand, the core objectives of English studies are often those desired by employers, like critical thinking, communication skills, and conflict resolution. But people don't see these actualities. All they see are possible or impossible $signs. Matt Buriesi, author of The Arts and Humanities Aren't Worth a Dime, argues that in a capitalist society, we place value on things based on how they perform in the workforce. This leads us to devalue things that don't perform well or have no perceived monetary value. He states, quote, "We cannot measure the value of these disciplines in dollars, so we have decided that they have no value at all, except some token value, like the parsley garnish on a 16-ounce steak. They're nice, but not really necessary, and certainly not as necessary as STEM." end quote. These arguments of the apparent uselessness of English studies across decades have shaped the way we view English and the humanities as a whole. Okay, I waxed poetic for 3 long paragraphs about how some people just find English studies hard, and I can just summarize it like this. English studies has the potential to be pretentious, convoluted, and unnecessarily flowery at times for no good reason. So can video essays. But I would argue that any subject can be viewed like this, especially math. Fuck math. Why are there letters in this equation? And then you have the other valid critique about how English studies are the white man's tool, especially with the history of the English language and how English literature was forced upon colonized people as a way to show them how quote-unquote great their colonizers were. What I'm defending here isn't English as a language or English literature. Even though I especially love the Romantic era, I couldn't care less about that aspect. I'm defending the core objectives that are often taught in English courses and other humanities, as I believe those transcend language, geography, and race, and should be applied to things outside of English studies. There are also slightly less valid critiques, in my opinion, posited by people like Dr. Scott Mason, a college professor who posts his lectures online. He made a video titled The History of Literary Theory from Plato to the Romantics in 2019, and this piqued my interest because I too took a literary theory course, and I wanted to see how a different professor would approach the subject. Dr. Mason's approach to teaching, at least in my opinion, is similar to Robin Hill's rant about the blue curtains. He asserts that contemporary literary theory denatures literature by excluding the author's intentions and audience reactions, leaving literature as an object to be acted upon by the reader. That's actually very true, especially of certain theories like new criticism, but new criticism is not exactly new, and certainly not a contemporary literary theory, at least not in the sense Dr. Mason defines contemporary literary theories. New criticism developed in the 1930s and was mainstream by the 1950s. It focused on close readings of text and systematic courses such as history, impressionism, and reading aloud. It's really what put English studies on the map as a more technical discipline because it did away with emotional readings and what they called fluff in favor of more practical analysis. I would argue that the people who have an issue with English studies really have an issue with new criticism, as most of their complaints have, in one way or another, something to do with new criticism's purist ideals. But Dr. Mason isn't really referring to new criticism when he mentions contemporary literary theory. In fact, he mainly names feminist, queer, and post-structuralist theory as those that are contemporary agendas being foisted upon the text, end quote. He claims that such views make it hard for students to enjoy learning because it makes an agenda out of reading. I don't want to make it an agenda at all times, he states. If you want to do that, go into politics. Get out of the classroom, end quote. Now, there's a lot I could say about Dr. Mason's lecture. I could say that it reveals a lot to me, that he primarily called out theories based around oppression, like feminist and queer theories, as political agendas. From my own research of his Twitter, which he has conveniently linked to his channel, I could also say that Mason's own political bias informs his lectures, leading to the irony of his condemning political agendas while letting his own guide a class. And that irony leads to even more irony when we consider my next point. Dr. Mason's lecture reveals another perceived flaw of English studies. And it's not about capitalism or how hard it is. It's not even that it sucks the fun out of the media, as he claims. It's that people want to believe that they can be unbiased in a field driven by bias. They want to believe that they can be apolitical while engaging in inherently political subjects. They don't want to believe art can be touched by these real-world concepts, so they pretend not to see them. In other words, they don't like looking in the mirror that English studies provides. I used to think like this. I thought it was possible to create art in a vacuum, but that's what got new criticism the boot in the 1960s, at the height of the civil rights movement. I think a new critic would watch Dr. Mason's video for what it is. They wouldn't go through the trouble of contextualizing his academic points with his real-life beliefs. And that may be something Dr. Mason wants, I don't know. But I think it's incomplete to hear about his ideas on these agendas without also knowing about his stances on other real-world concepts because they directly influence his beliefs. What are the humanities without the human world? For instance, I'm sure this retweet on his Twitter account that uses transphobic rhetoric may influence how he feels about queer theory, especially when we consider his earlier quote. Bias occurs in content because we are individuals with our own beliefs, and these beliefs guide what we do and say. Not even I, the prettiest, funniest, best girl on the planet, is immune to bias. My channel is full of bias because I'm not some neutral machine driven only by fact. I have emotions and prior life experiences that guide how I interact with everything. I don't find it coincidental that the times I get a flood of "you're overanalyzing" comments is when I post a video that specifically talks about politicized and oppressed identities. Horror movies apparently can't be an allegory for misogyny because it's just entertainment. You can't be a negative stereotype for mental health disorders because it's just a show on Netflix. Lana Del Rey can't be pulling from historical anti-Black and white supremacist rhetoric with her question for the culture because it was just an Instagram post. We don't want to look deeper into the media we consume because it reveals something we already don't want to contend with in our real lives. But the truth is, we feed our media, and our media feeds us. It's a cycle that produces nuance, and as consumers of that nuance, we need to be able to critically engage with that nuance. As Parker states, by choosing not to give weight to social issues, new critics deny, or we might even say suppress, the role of social conflict in literature, as if the symbols and patterns, the paradoxes, ambiguities, tensions, and ironies were all about language in a tunnel-visioned way that isolates language from history and culture, end quote. The humanities humanize us, and that's what people are either too afraid of seeing or too biased to contend with. That has led to an entire generation of uncritical masses who can see a blue curtain and not think about the real-world implications it may hold. According to the Fresno Pacific staff, the average U.S. citizen spends 721 minutes per day with media. Television remains the primary media outlet, with the average U.S. citizen spending 238 minutes a day watching television. Studies have shown that the average person is exposed to 10,000 brand marketing messages a day. Even right now, you're engaging with the media. You're watching a sponsored YouTube video, a video with ad breaks, and a comment section full of hundreds of other people. We are living in a media-saturated world where it's easier than ever for our decisions to be made for us if we're so easily persuaded. Media literacy and critical thinking is something we hear about all the time online, particularly on Twitter, where that sort of thing often goes to die. We constantly tell our peers to read beyond headlines for information or learn to effectively communicate with their partners. Funnily enough, English studies train students in these areas. Therefore, it's no coincidence that an entire generation that's incapable of critically and empathetically engaging with the media are so adamant against English studies, literary criticism, and nuance. According to Gretchen Swartz, media literacy is defined as, quote, the ability of a citizen to access, analyze, evaluate, and produce information for specific outcomes, end quote. This form of literacy is important in what Swartz calls the information age because we continuously engage with media in our day-to-day lives, far more than our predecessors did. This engagement, quote, influences how we talk, what we buy, for whom we vote, how we perceive others, and why we behave as we do, end quote. According to E. Taman, who Swartz cites in her essay, quote, media literacy is the ability to create personal meaning from verbal and visual symbols we take in every day through television, radio, computers, newspapers, magazines, and advertising. It's the ability to choose and select, the ability to challenge and question, the ability to be conscious about what's going on around us, and not be passive and vulnerable, end quote. In other words, media literacy fosters critical thinking and connection between the media and real life. Without the ability, or rather the desire, to critically engage with our media, at least on a here and there basis, we're leaving ourselves vulnerable to propaganda, to indoctrination, to radicalization. And on a lesser scale, we open ourselves up to just really bad takes on the internet. Rancid takes. Takes I have to read bravely on twitter.com and somehow go on about my day unchanged. And we let that guide us instead of challenging it. As Aristotle said, we're rhetorical beings. By ignoring that, we're constantly letting other people make our decisions for us. And the uncritical masses have let their predecessors make their decisions for them, while their predecessors have fooled them into believing their vulnerability is a strength. The sad thing is, this apathy surrounding English studies and the humanities does not make the humanities any less relevant in our world. It doesn't make us less emotional or reactionary. We just fail to be able to articulate those emotions, those reactions. We turn to other ways to communicate, ways that hurt or disparage others. Or, the blue curtains meme is just really funny. Who am I to say otherwise? I'm just some girl